I still remember the exact moment I decided that surviving was enough. Not thriving. Not dreaming. Just surviving. Waking up, eating whatever the orphanage had that morning, which was usually something that tasted like regret and lukewarm water, going to school, coming back, sleeping, repeating. I had built an entire philosophy around smallness, and I was proud of it. Proud of taking up as little space as possible. Proud of needing nothing from nobody. Then Harrington University happened and smallness stopped being a choice. But before I tell you about the worst and somehow best years of my life, let me tell you about the morning everything started unraveling. Not the orphanage. Not the scholarship letter. The morning I walked into the administrative building of Harrington University for the very first time with one bag, 2 changes of clothes, a rubber-banded phone that only worked if you held it at a very specific 45-degree angle, and enough hope to embarrass myself. I was 17 steps into that building when I walked directly into a wall of cologne so expensive it had probably never even heard of a grocery store. I stumbled backward, looked up, and the first thing I saw was a jaw so sharp it looked like it had been carved out of pure arrogance. Dark eyes that looked at me the way people look at something stuck to the bottom of their shoe. A white shirt that cost more than my entire existence. And he looked at me, actually looked at me, held eye contact for exactly 2 seconds, and then he smiled. I thought that smile meant something. I actually stood there like an absolute fool and thought maybe Harrington would not be so terrible after all. I was so wrong that I want to go back in time and shake myself. His name was Caden Holt. And that smile was the last remotely human thing he ever gave me. If you are new here, please subscribe because this story is going to take you somewhere you are not ready for and you do not want to miss a single second of it. Now let me tell you what Caden Holt actually was before I tell you what he became, because if I skip to the end you will not understand the weight of it. Caden Holt was the kind of beautiful that made you forget he was cruel. The kind of wealthy that made teachers look the other way. He walked through Harrington like the building had been named after his mood and everyone else was just renting space inside it. His father, Dominic Holt, owned roughly 40% of the school's funding. 3 buildings on campus bore the Holt name, and the annual scholarship gala that ironically funded my own attendance was a Holt family event. The man was everywhere without ever being present. A ghost made of money and influence and something darker that I would not understand until much later. But I am getting ahead of myself. My first week at Harrington, I kept my head down. I found my classes, I found the library, I found the cheapest meal option in the cafeteria, which was a bread roll and a prayer, and I kept to myself. I was doing so well. I was practically invisible, and I was thriving in my invisibility. Then Caden noticed me. Not in the way I had foolishly imagined that first morning. He noticed me the way a cat notices a mouse. With patience. With deliberate cruelty. Like he had been waiting for the right moment to make it hurt. It started small. The first time I raised my hand in Professor Aldridge's economics class and gave an answer that was apparently so correct that the professor asked me to stay after to discuss a research opportunity. I walked out of that class feeling something dangerously close to joy. Real joy. The kind that makes you stupid. I was halfway down the corridor when something hit the back of my head. I turned around. Nothing. Just a group of students walking past. Then I heard it. Laughter. Low, deliberate, the kind designed to make you feel like the punchline of a joke you were not told. I looked toward the sound and there he was, leaning against the wall with 2 of his friends, looking directly at me with that same carved jaw and those same dark eyes, except this time there was nothing in them that resembled a smile. One of his friends, a broad-shouldered boy they called Rex, was casually tossing a balled-up piece of paper. The same balled-up piece of paper that had just hit my head. I looked at Caden. He looked at me. Then he turned away like I was not worth the continued attention and said something to Rex that made them both laugh again. I told myself it was nothing. Boys being stupid. I was not going to let a paper ball ruin the best day I had had in years. 3 days later my notes disappeared. Not misplaced. Not lost. Disappeared. I had left them on my desk for 4 minutes while I went to ask the professor a question before class, and when I returned they were gone. 3 weeks of handwritten notes for the midterm we had in 2 days. Gone. I checked everywhere. Under the desk, in the bin, in the corridor. Nothing. I failed that midterm. My first ever failed exam in my entire life. I sat staring at that paper with its red markings, feeling something crack open in my chest that I could not name. I found my notes 2 days later. They were in the women's bathroom, torn into small pieces, floating in one of the sinks with the tap running. Someone had taken the time to tear every single page individually. That was not carelessness. That was intention. I did not have proof it was him. But I knew. The way you know things when your survival instincts have been sharpened by years of having nothing and needing to read every room you walk into just to stay safe. I knew. If you are feeling what I was feeling right now, drop a comment below, because trust me, it gets worse before it gets better. I went to the dean's office. I sat down across from Dean Hargrove, a small bird-like man who smiled too much and said too little, and I told him everything. The paper ball, the notes, the bathroom. I said Caden Holt's name clearly and carefully. I watched something flicker across Dean Hargrove's face. Not concern. Not anger on my behalf. Something else. Something I did not have a word for then. He told me he would look into it. He gave me a form to fill out. He offered me a glass of water with the energy of a man who had already decided nothing would come of this conversation. Caden received what I was told was a verbal warning. A verbal warning. The academic equivalent of someone patting your hand and saying now. I walked out of that office and made a decision. I was going to fight back. This was perhaps the worst decision I have ever made in my life, and I say this as someone who once tried to use a broken umbrella as an actual weapon in a rainstorm and ended up soaking wet and holding a stick. I had been watching some videos online, motivational ones, about standing up for yourself and not letting people walk over you, and one particularly inspiring 30-second clip of a woman who had confronted her workplace bully, and one had me feeling genuinely invincible. So the next time Caden walked past me in the corridor and Rex very deliberately knocked my books out of my hands and kept walking, I did not pick up my books. I straightened up. I walked up to Rex, who was at least 4 inches taller than me and built like someone who ate entire gym memberships for breakfast, and I said, and I quote, "You need to watch where you are going." The corridor went quiet. I mean actually quiet. The kind of quiet that has texture. Rex looked down at me. Then he looked at Caden. Caden was watching me with an expression I could not read. Not amusement exactly. Not anger. Something more complicated that I did not have the emotional bandwidth to analyze in that moment, because Rex had just stepped closer to me and the air had changed. What happened next I will not describe in full detail because this is a YouTube video and we have guidelines to respect, but I will tell you that I ended up on the floor. My bag was emptied across the corridor. And 3 of my things were broken, including my only pen that still worked properly. I will also tell you that not a single person in that corridor helped me. They watched. Some of them recorded it on their phones. And Caden Holt stood there the entire time and watched too with that same unreadable expression and said nothing. Did nothing. I lay there on that floor collecting my scattered belongings one by one, and I made myself a new promise. No more fighting back. Not like that. I was going to graduate. I was going to get out. That was all that mattered. But humiliation has a way of not letting you forget. The next report I filed was after Rex and his friends cornered me outside the library and poured an entire cup of coffee over my assignment that was due the next morning. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning writing that assignment by hand because my laptop had died and the school computers were booked. Every single word, soaked through and bleeding ink. I stood there holding that dripping paper, feeling something so far beyond anger that it had gone completely quiet inside me. Second verbal warning. This time for Rex only. Caden was not even mentioned because apparently there had been no direct evidence of his involvement. I sat across from Dean Hargrove again, and I watched his eyes, and I thought about that flicker I had seen the first time, and I filed it somewhere in the back of my mind. The semester moved like a slow bruise. Every time I had something good, something was taken. A study group I was invited to suddenly had no space for me the next week. A professor recommended me for a panel discussion, and I showed up to find my name had been quietly removed from the list. Little things. Constant things. The kind of erosion that does not leave visible marks, but hollows you out steadily from the inside. And through all of it, Caden Holt moved through the school like weather. Present everywhere. Responsible for the atmosphere. I hated him with the kind of hate that had become structural, load-bearing, a fundamental part of how I understood the world. I want you to like this video right now before we go any further, because what I am about to tell you next is where this story shifts and you are going to want the algorithm to bring you back for the rest of it. It was a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because I always closed from my grocery store shift at 9:30 on Thursdays, and the walk back to campus took me through the older part of the neighborhood where the streetlights were decorative rather than functional. I had my bag on my shoulder, my rubber-banded phone at its very specific 45-degree angle inside my jacket pocket because it was cold, and the cold made the battery worse. And I was thinking about the macroeconomics paper I had to submit by Friday morning. I heard it before I saw it. Low voices. The kind that are deliberately quiet. Then a sound that was not quite a shout and not quite a gasp and was located somewhere in the space between pain and surprise. I slowed down. I told myself not to stop. I had been surviving too long on too little to spend my survival on strangers. Then I saw the uniform. A Harrington blazer. Caught in the thin strip of light from a doorway. The posture of someone trying very hard not to show they were afraid and failing. And around that person 3 men who were large in the way that people are large when they want you to understand that size is a threat. I looked harder. I looked at the jaw first. Because that jaw was impossible to forget. It was him. Caden Holt. Standing in a dark alley being robbed by 3 men who looked like they had not arrived at this moment accidentally. I want you to understand what happened inside me in that moment because it is important. There was no heroic swelling of music. There was no sudden forgetting of every single thing he had done to me. I thought about the notes in the bathroom sink. I thought about the floor of that corridor and the scattered contents of my bag. I thought about every verbal warning and every flickering look from Dean Hargrove and every moment of being made to feel like I did not belong in a place I had earned my way into with my own mind. And then I thought about leaving him there. And I almost did. I picked up my bag. I turned around. I walked away. I got to the end of the street, turned the corner, pressed my back against the wall, and stood there in the dark breathing. 30 seconds passed. I came back. I do not have a beautiful explanation for why. I wish I did. I wish I could tell you it was about being the bigger person or rising above or some other thing that looks good on an inspirational poster. It was not any of that. It was simpler and stranger than that. It was just that I could not make myself be the kind of person who walked away. Even from him. Especially from him. Because if I walked away from him, I would be walking away from something in myself that I had been protecting since I was small, and had nobody, and had decided that I was still going to be good anyway. So I came back. And then I did the single most catastrophically ridiculous thing I have ever done in my 20 years on this earth. I need you to understand that my entire martial arts education came from watching kung fu movies on Sister Beatrice's ancient Nokia phone at the orphanage every Sunday after church. Sister Beatrice would fall asleep at exactly the 12-minute mark of any movie, and we children would switch it from whatever gospel program she had it on and find the kung fu films. I watched approximately 40 hours of cartoon kung fu over 6 years. I felt this was sufficient preparation. It was not sufficient preparation. I stepped into that alley. I planted my feet the way the cartoon masters always planted their feet, shoulder-width apart, slight bend in the knees. I raised my hands in what I genuinely believed was an intimidating fighting stance. I looked at the 3 men. They looked at me. Caden looked at me. There was a moment of silence so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat and also my own common sense trying desperately to communicate with me from somewhere very far away. Then I made the sound. The noise. The hi-hat that had always preceded the spectacular moves in the films. I produced it loudly and with full commitment. One of the men actually took a small step backward. I choose to believe this was out of genuine fear and not out of the shock of witnessing something so bewildering that the brain needed a moment to process it. What followed was not a fight. I want to be very clear about this. It was not a fight. What it was me throwing the most creative series of movements a human body has ever produced while 3 men tried to figure out what they were looking at. I spun. I lunged. I made sounds that I believe are not reproducible by any other human throat. At one point, I genuinely attempted a move I had seen a cartoon tiger perform, and I want you to sit with that information for a moment. I achieved nothing physically. I landed nothing. I connected with no one. What I did achieve was approximately 45 seconds of such profound confusion that Caden, who clearly had more functional survival instincts than I did, used that window to put distance between himself and two of the men. Then they caught me. It happened fast. One of them grabbed my arm and the performance was over. They searched my bag, phone, rubber-banded, cracked screen, held together by stubbornness and faith. They looked at it like it had personally offended them. A thin wallet with my grocery store wages from 2 days ago, which was not very much. A macroeconomics textbook. A half-eaten granola bar. They looked at their collection, and then they looked at me, and the look was not kind. I would like to tell you I was brave in that moment. I was not brave. I was terrified in the specific way that makes your legs feel like they have been replaced with suggestions of legs. I looked across the alley at Caden, and for just a second, just 1 second, I saw something cross his face that I did not have the vocabulary for yet. Not gratitude. Something rawer than that. Something that looked almost like pain. Then one of the men raised his hand, and I closed my eyes. And from the street behind me came a voice so loud it had no business belonging to one person. I am calling 911 right now. I have the location. I have 3 descriptions. Please confirm the address. The men froze. Then they ran. 3 large men scattering into the dark like they were made of paper. I opened my eyes. I turned around. There was a boy standing at the mouth of the alley holding his phone to his ear. He was not actually on a call. I could see the screen from where I stood. It was his calculator app. He had threatened 3 criminals with mathematics. He looked at me. He lowered the phone slowly. He said, in the most genuinely calm voice I had ever heard from someone whose hands were visibly shaking, "I have been trying to talk to you for 2 semesters. This was not how I planned to do it." His name was Noah. And before I could say anything, before I could even process what had just happened, I realized the alley behind me was empty. Caden was gone. If you are not subscribed yet, please subscribe right now, because what I am about to tell you about the weeks that followed is the part of this story I still cannot fully explain even to myself. Noah walked me back to campus that night and talked the entire way. Not nervously. Not to fill silence. Just talking, like he had been saving up things to say, and tonight had given him the excuse he needed. He told me he had watched me for 2 semesters. Not in a strange way, he clarified quickly, in a way that felt important to qualify. He told me he had wanted to sit next to me in macroeconomics since the first week, but every time he worked up the nerve something always happened. I was either already deep in a textbook or already leaving, or one time I had headphones in that he later realized were not connected to anything, but the commitment was impressive. I laughed. Genuinely, unexpectedly laughed. And I realized it was the first time I had laughed on this campus in months. Noah became my person. Not all at once, but in the way real things build, steadily and quietly, morning by morning. He would save me a seat. He shared notes without being asked. He remembered small things, the exact way I took my tea from the cafeteria, that I could not concentrate if there was music with lyrics playing, that I got a particular expression when I was trying not to show I was upset about something, and he would not push, but he would stay close. I did not know what to do with someone who stayed close. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. I kept waiting for the moment where the kindness revealed its price. It did not come. At least not in the way I was watching for. What came instead was Caden Holt, standing outside my economics lecture 3 weeks after the alley, waiting. Not approaching. Not speaking. Just standing there across the corridor with his hands in his pockets, looking at me with that expression I still did not have a word for. When I met his eyes, he looked away. When I walked past him, he did not follow. When I turned back at the end of the corridor, he was still standing there watching me go. This happened 4 times over 2 weeks. Different locations, same behavior. Standing. Watching. Leaving before any conversation could begin. I told myself I did not care. I had trained myself thoroughly in not caring about Caden Holt. But there is a particular type of unsettling that comes from someone behaving in a way that does not match your established understanding of them, and it sits under your skin like a splinter that you cannot find to remove. Then his parents called the school. Not for anything bad. That was the part that confused me most. His parents called the school and requested that I, specifically me, be assigned to work with Caden as an academic tutor for his upcoming financial law examinations. They were offering compensation. Real compensation. More than 2 weeks of my grocery store wages for 3 sessions. I sat with that information for a long time. Every sensible part of me said no. Every experienced part of me said no. But the part of me that had been calculating since childhood how to survive, how to make numbers work, how to stretch too little into enough, that part looked at the amount they were offering and said something different. I said yes. And if you think you know where this is going, I promise you, you do not. Like this video right now and stay with me because the ground is about to shift under both of us. The first session was in the Holt Building library. Private, silent, all dark wood and books that had probably never been opened. I arrived early and sat down and reminded myself that this was a transaction. He needed to pass his exams. I needed the money. Nothing else was happening in this room. He arrived 4 minutes late. He sat down across from me. He put his textbook on the table. And then he did nothing for 45 seconds except look at the table. I said, we should start with the liability frameworks from Chapter 9. He said, I know it was you. I went very still. He said, in the alley. I know it was you. I recognized you when you did the thing. I said, what thing? He said, the noise. He paused. And then, with absolutely no expression, he reproduced my haya with startling accuracy. I wanted to die. I wanted the Holt Building library to develop a sudden structural fault directly beneath my chair and swallow me into the earth. I said, I do not know what you are talking about. He said, you came back. You saw me and you left and then you came back. I said nothing. He said, why? I said, Chapter 9. Liability frameworks. He looked at me for a long time. Then he opened his book. He did not ask again. But something in the room had changed and we both knew it. The sessions continued. 1 a week, then twice a week as his exams approached. He was not stupid. I want to say that clearly, because it would be easy to assume that, and it would be wrong. He was sharp in the way that people are sharp when they have been taught to think strategically rather than academically. He saw patterns in case law quickly. He argued well. When I challenged his reasoning, he did not get defensive. He got interested, leaning forward slightly, turning the problem over, coming at it from a different direction. It was deeply inconvenient. Noah, meanwhile, had started doing a thing. A thing I noticed, but did not name for a while because naming it would require me to think about what it meant, and thinking about what it meant would require me to risk the only good thing in my life at Harrington. He would arrive before me to places I was going. He would find reasons to be near me. He looked at me sometimes with an expression that was patient in a way that felt like it was waiting for me to catch up to something. I did not let myself catch up to it. Then one evening, the 4th tutoring session, Caden and I had been working for 2 hours and something had shifted into something easier, the formal edges of the thing smoothing down into something that was almost natural. And I made a joke about one of the cases we were reviewing, something small and stupid, and he laughed. Actually laughed. Not the low deliberate thing from the corridors. A real laugh that changed his whole face into something unguarded and young, and I thought, and I hated myself for thinking it, I thought, there he is. Whoever is in there underneath all of that. I looked away quickly. He stopped laughing. In the silence that followed, I felt him looking at me. He said, slowly, you never asked me why. I kept my eyes on my notes. I said, why what? He said, why any of it? The notes. All of it. You never once asked me why. I said, because it does not matter why. Actions are what they're regardless of reason. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that is either very wise or very unfair. I have not decided which. I looked up at him then. I could not help it. And he was closer than I had registered, leaned forward across the table, and his expression was the most open I had ever seen it. No performance in it, no architecture, just something sitting there plainly on his face that I was not prepared for. He kissed me. It was not aggressive. It was not entitled the way I might have expected something from him to be. It was almost careful. Like a question. Like something he had been deciding whether to do for a long time and had finally just decided. I pulled back. Immediately and completely. I stood up and gathered my things with the specific controlled efficiency of someone managing something they will be having feelings about privately for a very long time. I said, "This is not part of the arrangement. I will see you at the next scheduled session if you still want to continue." He did not stop me. He just sat there watching me leave with that same expression, and I did not look back. I was halfway across campus, still moving fast, when Noah appeared. This was not unusual, he often walked this path at this time. But tonight he stopped directly in front of me and his expression was different. No patience in it. Something decided. He said, "I need to tell you something, and I need to tell you now before I lose my nerve again." I was still vibrating from the library. I was not in a condition to receive information, but the look on his face stopped me. He said, "I like you. Not as a friend, though I am also that. I like you in a way that makes me want to be wherever you are and makes everything better when you are near it." I know the timing is terrible. I know I probably should have said this differently. But I needed you to know. I stood there in the middle of campus at 9:45 at night, having been kissed by one boy and confessed to by another within the space of 20 minutes, and I thought to myself, I survived an orphanage, a scholarship interview, a robbery attempt, and a cartoon kung fu performance, and this right here, is what is going to break me. I told Noah I needed time. I told him I cared about what we had, and I did not want to damage it by being careless with it. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he would wait. I went back to my room and I sat on my bed and I did not sleep. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of complicated. Caden showed up to the remaining sessions. He said nothing about the kiss. He was not strange about it, not cold, not falsely normal. He was just present in a way that was consistent and quiet, and I found this harder to navigate than anything else he had ever done to me because cruelty I knew how to hold. This I did not. And then everything cracked open. It started with a conversation I was not supposed to hear. I had stayed late in the administrative building to submit a reprint of a document for my scholarship renewal. The offices were supposed to be empty. I was walking past Dean Hargrove's office when I heard voices inside. 2 of them. I recognized one immediately. I stopped. I know I should not have stopped. Every sensible cell in my body was telling me to keep walking. But the tone of the conversation was wrong in a way I felt physically, a low urgent pressure in it that did not belong in a late evening administrative office. I caught fragments. A name repeated. My name. Something about monitoring. Something about a report. Something about the scholarship conditions. And then a phrase that stopped my heart clean. She cannot stay if she becomes a problem. I did not know the second voice. Not then. I keep this moment with me still because it is the moment the story I thought I was living turned into a different story entirely, one with a shape I had not been able to see because I had been standing too close to the surface of it. Subscribe right now if you are not already, because what comes next is what everything has been building toward, and I need you to be here for it. I went to Noah that night. I told him what I heard. He went very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. A controlled kind of still. He asked me exactly what I had heard and in what order. He asked me if I had seen who the second person was. I said no. I described the voice. Something moved across Noah's face. Quick, gone before I could read it. He said, "We should be careful about this." He said, "You should not go digging on your own." I looked at him. And for the first time since the alley, since the calculator app and the running commentary and the saved seats and the small kindnesses, I felt something cold and quiet settle in my stomach. I said, "How long have you been wanting to be my friend?" He said, "Since the first semester." I said, "But you never approached me. You waited until the alley." He said, "I told you, I thought you had written everyone off." I said, "Or you were waiting for a specific moment." He stopped. He looked at me. And in his eyes I saw the thing I had been hoping was not there. Not guilt exactly. Something more complex. Something that looked like a person who had started doing one thing and had become, quietly and genuinely and with no exit available, something entirely different. He said my name. Just my name. Like that was the only honest sentence he had. I left. I walked across campus in the dark and I thought about survival and about being small and about the philosophy I had built and how many times I had been inside someone else's plan without knowing it. I went to Caden. I do not know why Caden. I could not have explained it that night, and I cannot fully explain it now except that I had run out of people I was certain of, and he was the one person whose worst I already knew. There was a strange safety in that. In having nothing left to discover on the dark side. He opened his door and looked at me. I said, I heard something in Hargrove's office. I told him. All of it. He went very still. Then he stepped back and let me in. What he told me next took a long time. Not because he was evasive, but because some truths have weight and have to be set down carefully. He told me about his father. Not the version that appeared at gala dinners and wrote checks with extra zeros to keep buildings named after himself. The version that ran the other side of things. The version that had been bleeding the school's funding through a system he and Hargrove had built together over years. Quiet corruption dressed in charity. He told me that the day I had passed the administrative corridor 2 months before the bullying started, the day I had paused outside the meeting room because I thought I had the wrong classroom, that day his father had seen me through the glass. Had clocked the timing. Had asked Hargrove to find out who I was. He told me that his father had a history of removing problems quietly. That he had done it before. That when Caden found out I was the girl who had been near that room that day, he had made a decision that was wrong and desperate, and the only thing he could think of that might work. If she is humiliated enough, she becomes invisible. If she is invisible, she is not a threat. If she is not a threat, my father leaves her alone. He said it to the window. Not to me. Like he could not say it to my face. I sat with that for a long time in the silence of his room. I thought about the notes in the bathroom. About the corridor floor. About every verbal warning and every moment of erosion. About the specific calculation he had made with my dignity as the currency. I said, you could have told me. He said, if I had told you, you would have become a liability to him. He does not handle liabilities quietly. There was a girl 3 years ago. She found something she should not have found. She did not finish her degree. I said, what happened to her? He looked at me then. He did not answer. He did not have to. The silence was its own answer. And then he said, the night in the alley. Those men were not random. Someone sent them. I had been getting too close to evidence, things I had been quietly collecting because I was tired of all of it, tired of being his son, tired of what that had required me to become. Someone told him. And he sent a message. I thought about the alley. About turning back. About cartoon kung fu and a rubber-banded phone and a boy with his calculator app. I said, Noah was sent to watch me. Caden said yes. I said, by your father. Through Hargrove. He said yes. I said, does Noah know I know? He said, I do not know what Noah knows anymore. I think he stopped being what they sent him to be a long time ago. But that does not change what he was at the start. I sat there and I thought about the boy who had saved me with mathematics. Who had remembered how I took my tea. Who had looked at me with patience like he was waiting for me to catch up. And I thought about how it is possible for something to be two things at once. How a beginning can be a lie and still grow into something real. How that does not make it clean. How that does not make it simple. How nothing about any of this was clean or simple. I looked at Caden. At the jaw that had once looked like arrogance and now looked like a person who had been carrying something very heavy in a way that had bent him wrong. At the eyes that had watched me from across corridors for months. At the hands that had done nothing to stop Rex that day in the corridor and had quietly stopped 3 worse things I never knew were coming. I said, you are going to have to show me. All of it. Everything you have collected. Because if we are going to finish this, we are going to do it together and we are going to do it right. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, we. I said, do not make it strange. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The beginning of one. He got up and went to his desk and I watched him pull out a folder that was thick with months of quiet work and I thought about survival again. About how I had built my philosophy around smallness and about how smallness had failed to protect me anyway, and maybe the answer was never to be smaller. Maybe it was always to be exactly this. Exactly here. Exactly awake. Noah came to find me the next morning. He stood in the doorway of the library, and he looked like someone who had spent the night deciding something. He said, I need to tell you everything. He did. He told me how it started, what he had been asked to do, when it changed, why he stayed. He did not minimize the beginning. He did not ask me to forgive the origin because of the destination. He just laid it all down and let me look at it. I listened. I thanked him. I told him he was one of the most genuinely good people I had ever met, which I believed, and that the beginning of us would always be something I would have to sit with, which was also true. I told him I cared about him, and that care was real, and that I hoped one day the shape of what we were would settle into something we could both stand in comfortably, but that right now I did not know what that shape was. He nodded. He said he understood. He did not ask for more than that. This, more than anything, made me believe that what he had become was real. The rest moved fast in the way things move once the ground has already shifted. Caden and I took what he had collected to someone outside the school. A journalist. A woman who had been quietly investigating Dominic Holt for 2 years from a different angle and needed exactly the kind of internal documentation that Caden had spent months assembling. It ran 6 weeks later. Every detail. The funding diversion. Hargrove's involvement. The scholarship clause that had been designed as a removal mechanism. The girl from 3 years ago, who came forward once the story broke, who had been quietly living with what had been done to her and waiting for a moment that felt safe enough. Dominic Holt's name was removed from 3 buildings and 1 scholarship fund within a month. Dean Hargrove resigned. The investigation that followed was long, and I will not tell you everything that happened inside it, because some of that is not my story to tell. What I will tell you is this. The morning after the story ran, I was sitting on the steps outside the economics building with a cup of tea that was exactly the right temperature, and the campus was doing the thing it sometimes does in early morning where the light comes through the trees at a particular angle and makes everything look like the beginning of something. Caden sat down next to me. Not across from me. Next to me. Close enough that I could see the tiredness in his face and the thing underneath the tiredness that looked like relief. Like a person who had been holding a breath for a very long time and had finally let it go. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "I owe you an apology that no sentence is actually large enough to be. I know that. I am not going to insult you by pretending otherwise." I said, "No. You are going to owe me something much more uncomfortable than an apology." He said, "What?" I said, "Honesty. Ongoing and consistent. That is harder and it costs more, and it is what I actually need." He looked at me. He said, "I can do that." I said, "I know you can. That is why I am sitting here." He was quiet again. Then very quietly he said, "You came back. That night. You saw me and you left and you came back for someone who had given you every reason not to." I said, "I know." He said, "Why?" I looked out at the morning light through the trees. I thought about Sister Beatrice's Nokia phone and cartoon kung fu and a rubber-banded phone and a girl who had built her whole philosophy around smallness and been wrong about it from the start. I said, "Because I am the kind of person who comes back. I am still figuring out if that is a strength or a flaw." He said, quietly, "It is the most important thing about you." I did not look at him when he said that. But I felt it. The way you feel something that lands in a place that has been waiting for it without knowing it was waiting. We sat there in the morning light, and the campus moved around us, and the story that had felt for so long like something being done to me started to feel, for the first time, like something I was living. Which is different. It is so different. It took time after that. Real time. Not a montage, not a sudden arrival at something clean and resolved. Caden and I moved toward each other the way 2 people move toward each other when they have history that requires respect, slowly, with full eyes open, choosing it deliberately rather than falling into it. There were hard conversations. There were moments where I sat with what had been done and felt it fully rather than filing it away. There were evenings where we talked until late about everything and mornings where we said almost nothing, and both of those were right in their own way. Noah and I found our shape eventually. It took longer. It was more fragile in the way that things are fragile when they have a complicated beginning. But it settled into something true. Something I think we were always building toward even when the blueprint was wrong. We sat next to each other in macroeconomics until graduation, and he remembered how I took my tea, and I never stopped being grateful for the calculator app. I graduated at the top of my class. That part one had always known was going to happen. That part was never in question. What I had not known, what I could not have predicted standing in that administrative building on my first day with one bag and 2 changes of clothes and a rubber-banded phone, was that surviving was never actually going to be enough for me. That I was always going to be someone who came back. That the philosophy I had built around smallness was going to get dismantled piece by piece, not by the cruelty, but by the parts in between the cruelty that I had not let myself see clearly enough to name. I am telling you this story because I think there are people who have built the same philosophy, who have decided that needing nothing from nobody is the safest way to move through the world. And I want you to know that I understand why you built it. I understand the logic of it completely. I just want you to know that it has a ceiling. And beyond the ceiling there is something that does not have a name yet but feels, on a good morning with the right temperature tea and someone sitting close enough that you can see the tiredness in their face and the relief underneath it, feels a great deal like enough. This is where I leave you for now. But there is more to this story, and I mean that in every sense. If you want to know what happened with Dominic Holt's investigation and what was found inside it, if you want to know what the girl from 3 years ago eventually did with her voice, if you want to know about the moment I finally let myself say out loud what Caden was to me and what he said back, subscribe right now, leave me a comment telling me which part of this hit you hardest, because I read every single one. And I will see you in the next one. I promise you it is worth staying for.